Okay, hello everyone. So wild capture commercial fisheries are a major contributor to global protein production. Bottom-tendered fishing gear, so that's commercial fishing gear that has potential to impact the seafloor by touching the seafloor, such as trawl or dredge or pots, make up a huge amount of global seafood. Trawl fisheries, like the Cape Horn here, this is off Alaska, she's actually out operating right now. She's also being plagued by orcas because they're actually interfering with another experiment we have right now. But trawl-based fisheries alone capture 32 million metric tons of seafood annually. That's about 20% of global seafood production. Put that in perspective, that's 1.5 times the annual red meat production of the US, and we eat a lot of red meat. But in terms of conservation of the ocean, they can present some negative impacts because they do contact the seafloor occasionally. Now, one thing people aren't aware of is most of the places bottom-tendered fishing gear is used is actually on flat, muddy bottom, because if it's very rocky or reefy, that destroys the gear. So there may be a bit of misinformation out there. But these muddy shelf-type ecosystems do have articulated organisms that can be damaged from fishing. What you see on the picture on the right here are sea whips. These are super abundant across the Bering Sea shelf, and they can get mowed down by trawling. So there is some impact. The management process, at least within the US, is now concerning itself with mitigating impact or reducing impact on the seafloor from commercial fishing, and that's where we're getting involved. In fact, right now we're at a watershed moment for seafloor impact management in terms of the policy enacted to manage federal fisheries, at least in the US. Again, I'm going to focus on the US here because we have strong central management through the Commercial Fisheries Management Councils. We have something called the Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Management Conservation Act, which probably a lot of you have not heard, but it's overarching federal legislation that guides fishery management in the US. Part of that is that we, to the extent practical, need to minimize impact on seafloor ecosystems, insofar that we need to minimize impact on what's called essential fish habitat. So that's where we come in. So up until 2010, there's actually been a reprieve for management in the US that managers haven't actually had to justify what they're doing with deciding how much we can harvest on fish and where we can harvest it in terms of its impact on essential fish habitat. But starting in 2010, managers are now tasked with justifying their harvest decisions and demonstrating, to the extent practicable, impacts on essential fish habitat are mitigated. So now globally there are 2 different tools that we use to manage impacts from fishing on the benthos, the seafloor. The first are marine reserves, so spatial zoning in the ocean. Conceptually it's very straightforward. If you put up a marine reserve, don't allow fishing there, then there's no impact to the benthos. But there are potentially conservation and definitely economic trade-offs with going with marine reserves. First off, if you displace harvesters from a space in the ocean, they still need to take their harvest, so they end up fishing more in a smaller amount of area. Now, if you're fishing more, you have more potential to contact the bottom, and that might mitigate some of the habitat savings by closing out areas. Furthermore, economically, the amount of marine reserves that we're enacting, I would note that when marine reserves are enacted, it's extremely rare that they're monitored, reevaluated, and then decisions are made to actually retract them if they're not satisfying their objective. Usually they're just put in place, and that's the end of it. Here's an example of very productive fishing grounds. These are Alaskan fishing grounds, some of the most productive fishing grounds in the world, and all the colored polygons are fishing closures in Alaskan waters. And so each year there are propositions to close out more area for conservation concerns, but it's coming to the point now where the economic trade-offs we're making as a society are starting to impact the bottom line of these commercial fisheries. Like if you look at the Bering Sea, which is above the Aleutian chain there's a whole lot of area that's in some kind of closure. So there's another solution. That's a technical solution. Instead of closing out areas from fishing, we can modify the fishing gear to keep it up off the bottom while still maintaining high catch rates. There's a small dedicated group of scientists around the world that are trying to do these things. An example on the screen here is something called the sweep modification, and I'm actually going to show through simulation what kind of impact this can have at Oceanscape scales. So basically a trawl sweep, a trawl is a net that you drag on the bottom. You have doors that spread the net open. Between the doors and the net you have these long wire cables, and they're kind of like lawnmowers for the seafloor ecosystem, and they just scrape the bottom and can cut things off. But if you simply put some spheres on the lines, they're called bobbins, you can create lift and get those sweeps up off the ground and greatly reduce impact. We can measure that. We can measure contact on the seafloor. We can demonstrate impact to ecosystems. But interestingly, technical solutions are not really being discussed and definitely not implemented in any great frequency for management of seafloor impacts, at least in the US. We're pretty much solely going with marine reserves. And the reason for that is there's a lack of tools to demonstrate to policymakers what are the trade-offs with going with marine reserves versus potential for gear modification. So that's what we're getting involved in. So here we're not optimizing anything, we're using computation as a simulation tool to inform policy decisions. We've developed a very simple habitat model which just describes its discrete time. It describes the impact and recovery of different habitat features across the ocean. Some of the key inputs are fishing effort, parameters which relate fishing effort to damage to the seafloor, and then very simply a recovery rate of damaged seafloor. There's a little more detail than that, but that's the 30,000 foot overview. Now, what we would need to do this pragmatically on an Oceanscape scale is that we would need to know what the ecosystem looks like distributed across the ocean. You know, where are the sponges, are they in this cell, or are they not in that one, et cetera. But we don't have that. That would be impractical. But what we do have is we have about 100 years of sediment information from basin-wide across most of the US of these oceans. From that, we can smooth these grab samples and come up with sediment maps for the ocean. And we've done that. We've got a geospatial workflow worked out for this, at least within the Bering Sea, which I'm going to be talking about today here. Again, the Bering Sea is, do we have a pointer here? Yeah, okay. Bering Sea is this big chunk of water here. If you ever had a fish sandwich from McDonald's, it probably came from this ocean. And then, so we've got sediment maps. We can then go to the literature and we know what types of plants and animals live on different sediment types, and now we can map ecosystems onto our model domain. We also use literature and combinations of expert opinion to come up with what are impact rates from gear contact to get habitat features of interest, and what are their recovery rates. So we're populating this model. I'm just going to show some results here from the Bering Sea. We have 160 5 by 5 kilometer grid cells that we're running this model. And we have very good data on spatially explicit fishing effort, how much fishing effort by different gears have gone on. Okay, and just the last slide here. These are some preliminary results. And I just want to highlight how powerful of a tool this is promising to be to communicate to policymakers. So what we have on the screen here is we've been able to populate the model for at least one fishery of interest. This is bottom trawl fishing in the Bering Sea. And what you see on the screen here, this is basically a time series from 2003 to 2014. And this is a heat map over time. And the darker areas are cumulatively greater seafloor impact. And I want to highlight a few things here. First, I had talked about before about this displacement problem when you have marine reserves. We can see that happening in real time and communicate that to policymakers here in terms of our habitat impact index. These white chunks here are marine reserves. And what happens is for a lot of fish stocks in the Bering Sea and other oceans is they migrate in paths. And we see here fish are migrating across here, and then they go through this closure, and then the fleet builds up along the edge trying to chase them through there. And we can actually show to policymakers you're getting a buildup of habitat impact around the closures. If we look at this cumulatively over the whole model domain, that's this plot on the right here, I'd like to point out two policy shocks on this system. Greg, you'll probably find this one pretty cool. This is Amendment 80. This is property rights. Property rights were implemented for this fishery. So what that means basically is it's no longer a competitive race to catch fish. All the boats in the fleet have a guaranteed right to their portion of catch. So they can go out and fish on their own time scale. They can share information with other agents and maximize catch efficiency. What that did was all things the same. What it did was allow for economic efficiency, and they had to fish less. And we can demonstrate that that had domain-wide reduction in seafloor impact. Now the other, if you notice here, that kind of sets off a trajectory of declining cumulative habitat reduction. There's one other policy shock here that sets it off even on a steeper trajectory. That was the induction of sweep modifications. That was the technical solution. That was putting the bobbins on the sweeps and reducing seafloor contact by 80%. So again, future steps on this are actually populating the model for different fisheries. It takes a long time to get all the information into the model. And then we want to use this as a tool to explicitly look at trade-offs between using marine reserves versus technical solutions and bringing some of that information to the decision-making policymakers. And basically present them with a tool where they can actually compare apples with apples. That is, in terms of habitat reduction, when and under what circumstances can gear modifications equal what we see from spatial closures in terms of habitat impact management. So I'll just leave it there and open it up to any questions if we have time.